Welcome to the kitchen at Early Bird Farm and Mill. This is your farmer and miller, Drew Speroni, and I'm going to talk to you today about baking slow ferment sourdough bread. The first thing you're going to do is you're going to take your mixing bowl and put it on the scale, and you're going to tare the scale to 0. Then you're going to take 200 grams of Early Bird Farms hard red spring wheat flour and put it in the bowl. Then you're going to take 500 grams of Early Bird Farms all-purpose flour and put that in the bowl. Then you're going to put 200 grams of Early Bird Farms rye flour. So that's going to make 900 grams total. Then you're going to take 675 grams of room temperature water. Hopefully the room is somewhere between 70 and 78 degrees. And then once you do that, you're going to take the bowl and you're going to put it on the mixer, and you take a dough hook and you hook the dough on low speed just until the water and the flour are thoroughly mixed. Then you're going to take the dough hook and the bowl off of the mixer. You're going to cover it and you're going to let it sit for 10 minutes. Once it's sat for 10 minutes, then you're going to put the bowl back on the scale, tare it again, and you're going to add 21 grams of salt. We use Himalayan salt. And then you're going to take your leaven and you're going to add 250 grams of leaven to the dough. Now when I do that, I don't like to touch the salt to the leaven directly. I don't want the salt to kill the wild yeasts. So I do it separately. Until I get that bowl back onto the mixer. And then I put it back on low. And then I set the timer for usually 12 minutes. And depending on how warm it is, depending on the weather, depending on how the dough is feeling, I will let it mix between 12 and 15 minutes. You really want to let it hook for a while to get all those whole grains to absorb into the water. You want them to all mix really well. And then I take this time while it's mixing to separate some leaven. So I'll take what's left of the leaven and I'll separate it and I'll give it away, and I'll leave just 50 grams in the container. I'll add 3 parts of the 3 different types of flour we used for the bread, the hard red, the all-purpose, and the rye, to 250 grams. It doesn't have to be equal parts, it's whatever you feel. I like to add just a little bit of rye to make the leaven more active. And then you're going to add 225 grams of the room temperature water to that 50 grams of leaven that's left in the bowl. Now this doesn't have to be absolutely exact, but you have to have at least 50 grams, and you don't want it to be over 75 grams. Then I'll mix it by hand just until the flour is fully mixed into the water. Then I'll let that sit. And I usually do this in the afternoon, sometime between about 4 o'clock in the afternoon and 6 o'clock in the afternoon. And by the next day, by about 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, it's ready to go. As long as you bake by 8 o'clock that night, you're going to have great leaven. If you choose not to bake that night, separate out 250 grams, give it to a neighbor or a friend, and do the whole leaven process again. So then you're going to take your dough off the mixer, wash that dough hook, and then you're going to cover it and just let it sit for 30 to 45 minutes. After 30 to 45 minutes, you're going to fold it. And the way I fold is I kind of pull, I scoop under and pull up. I'm careful not to get any air pockets inside as I'm folding it. And I'm just going to fold it a few times, just 4 or 5 times. After 30 to 45 minutes, I'll come back and I'll fold it again. This time, as it's folding 4 or 5 times, I'm paying attention to the elasticity. And I know when that whole piece of dough is starting to lift out of the bowl that it's doing what it's supposed to do, that the leaven is working its way through the dough. So I'll do this 4 to 8 times. I'll do the folding process. And depending on the temperature, depending on the dough, you might have to do it more. You know it's getting ready when that whole loaf is pulling all the way out of the bowl. I'm then going to prepare my cutting board with some flour, sprinkling some flour on top. I usually use all-purpose flour for the sprinkling. Also sprinkle flour on the bannetons. Not too much, but just enough so that when I set the dough and the bannetons, it's not going to stick to the bannetons. It is a challenging thing to get that dough off of the bannetons. So then I'm going to scoop the whole big piece of dough off onto the cutting board. And then I'm going to cut it in half with my dough cutter. Now this is the fun part. This is the art part of the dough shaping. And so what I do is I take the outside and I fold the outside into the middle. So I'm turning it and folding it at the same time. Turning it with one hand, folding it with the other, folding it to the center, and I'm pushing down so that when I push down, the rest of the dough pushes out. So I'm doing this to create a nice round dough ball. And when you do it, you want to be careful not to get any air pockets in there. And then you flip it over. This part's rhythmic. It's a meditation for me. Then I'm going to get my hands wet because it's a lot easier to shape the dough with your wet hands. Then your hands don't stick to the dough as easily. So then what I'm doing is I'm pulling from top to bottom down, at the same time turning it around to shape it round, but also stretching it so that it stretches underneath. I'm going to form a nice tight round ball. Then I set them in the bannetons, right in the center. And then I cover them. At home, generally, I'll use a shower cap to cover them. I can reuse the shower cap. Here I'm using plastic, but you want something that doesn't breathe so good. So usually those covers that come with the bannetons are not adequate for what we're doing here. Then I put them in the fridge, and they're going to stay overnight. And at 6 o'clock in the morning, the next morning, those loaves are going to be ready to put in the oven. So then I'm going to preheat the oven in the morning at 475 degrees. I want those Dutch ovens to also get to 475 degrees. So once the oven hits 475, I let it sit for 10 minutes before putting the bread in. Then I take the Dutch ovens out of the oven. I take the bannetons out of the fridge, and I do all of this pretty quickly and smoothly because one of the keys to getting a good rise with whole grain bread is having a good wide temperature between the cool bread and the hot Dutch ovens. So I make sure I sprinkle a little bit of all-purpose flour on top of those loaves, which is going to be the bottom. That's going to make sure that we don't get any loaves sticking to the bottom of our Dutch oven. Place them right in the middle. Careful, that Dutch oven is hot. Now I put them carefully back into the oven. And then I set the temperature of the oven to 450 degrees. And I set the timer for 25 minutes. After 25 minutes, I come back and I dial the oven up to 460 degrees. And I set the timer for 15 minutes. After that 15 minutes is done, my bread should be ready. I carefully take those Dutch ovens out of the oven. I usually use a wooden spatula in my hand to scoop them out of there and put them on a cooling rack. And there you are, 2 beautiful slow ferment sourdough loaves of bread with fresh milled early bird flour.